200 acres of England's best farmland did absolutely nothing this year. No wheat, no barley, no seed in the ground at all. Every field around it failed in its own way. Heat, blight, disease. This one field failed at nothing, because nothing was ever risked on it. A man worth £60 million looked at 200 acres of prime English soil and decided the smartest thing he could grow on it was silence. Farmers laughed when they first heard it. Then they ran their own numbers. The laughing stopped fast, because it wasn't neglect. It wasn't a bad year getting worse. It was a decision. Cold, deliberate, spreadsheet-driven. The kind of call a fund manager makes the moment a market turns against him. Jeremy Clarkson didn't fail to farm 200 acres. He calculated, in writing, that farming them would guarantee a loss, and he walked away before the loss arrived. That single decision should terrify anyone still pretending British farming is fine. By the end of this, you'll understand why the quietest thing Clarkson has ever done on that farm might end up being the most important. Start with the number that actually matters here. Not 200 acres. Not the estate's total size. The number underneath both of them. It is, quite simply, impossible to make money from growing food. That's not a headline exaggerating him. That's his own sentence, in his own column, with his own name attached. Think about what that admission costs a man like Clarkson. This is someone who spent 5 series proving, painfully, publicly, that farming can be beaten with enough stubbornness and enough money behind it. And here he is, admitting the numbers finally won. Rewind to where this machine actually started, because nothing about diddly squat has ever been one story. It's always been the same story, told through a different door. The farm shop wasn't a farm shop. It was a loyalty engine that turned a struggling arable business into a queue stretching down a country lane, doing in a car park what supermarkets spend millions trying to fake. Hawkstone wasn't a celebrity beer brand. It was a vertically integrated agricultural business hiding inside a pint glass, and Carlsberg found that out the expensive way, £50 million too late. Every part of that machine has run on the same logic. Find the asset nobody else can replicate. Squeeze value out of it in a way a spreadsheet alone would never suggest. Let everyone else call it luck. 200 empty acres is that exact same logic, just running backwards. Here's what nobody watching the headlines actually clocked. For years, British farming ran on a safety net nobody talked about much. European subsidies quietly topped up land that barely broke even on its own. Not glamorous, not exciting. It worked, the way a threadbare coat still gets you through winter. Then that system left with Brexit, and what replaced it paid farmers for looking after hedgerows and soil health instead of growing food at all. A fine idea on paper. In practice, the old money left faster than the new money arrived, and an entire industry has been quietly bleeding out in that gap ever since. Diesel climbing, fertiliser climbing, a carbon tax on fertiliser production sitting on the horizon like weather nobody can outrun. And at the end of every single cost, a wheat price set in Chicago by people who have never once stood on English mud in November. Clarkson lived every line of that on camera. TB tore through his herd. Heat waves scorched crops he'd spent a fortune planting. An oat harvest he described as the color of a hearing aid. 5 series was one very expensive lesson in exactly how hard English soil is to make pay, filmed by a man who genuinely didn't need the money and did it anyway. Which is exactly why real farmers, the ones with no camera crew and no fallback career, found something like relief in watching him lose at the same fight they'd been quietly losing for a decade. But here is where it gets interesting, because Clarkson didn't just stumble into this admission. He told everyone it was coming. Back in 2023, writing quietly in a column most of the country skipped past, he called it his last roll of the dice. Warned that the subsidies he'd leaned on to offset selling food at a loss were drying up, and that farming under those conditions from here on would simply cost him money. That wasn't hindsight. That was a man reading his own accounts 3 years before the maths finally, definitively stopped working. Now stop, because what comes next is the part almost nobody reported properly, and it's the part that turns this from a farming story into something much bigger. With a new government in place, one of the first big appointments to rural policy was Dame Angela Eagle, handed the job of deciding whether people like Clarkson can make a living off English soil at all. Clarkson wasn't reassured. He wasn't quiet about it either. He pointed out, with obvious relish, that her most memorable moment in public life was being told across the dispatch box to calm down, dear. Not, he said, a resume that inspires confidence in anyone holding a diesel bill. The council thought a car park objection could bury Clarkson's farm. Instead, they became unpaid co-writers on the most watched farming show in the country. Now the same pattern is playing out at a national level. Every objection, every appointment critics thought would embarrass him, hands him a bigger platform and a sharper argument. That is the reveal competing videos on this topic completely miss. This isn't a new fight. It's the exact same one, just with Westminster standing where the council used to stand. Here's the second reveal, and it's the one that actually explains the empty field. A farm that barely breaks even on food has, for years now, earned its real money everywhere else. The pub, the shop, the brewery. Every part of the operation that isn't technically farming. The failure is the product. It's the most counterintuitive business model in British broadcasting, and it's been sitting in plain sight since Series 1. 200 acres left empty isn't Clarkson admitting defeat. It's the same instinct that built a £75 million brewery out of rejected barley, just pointed at protecting capital instead of growing it. He didn't stop farming because he ran out of stubbornness. He stopped farming that land because, for once, the sums told him to sit still, and he actually listened. Here's the third reveal, and it's the sharpest one. Solar panels are spreading across fields that once grew barley, earning income that doesn't care about rainfall, or wheat prices, or whether TB rips through the herd next spring. Rewilding schemes are turning working farmland back into wetland, paid for by the same environmental payments that replace the old subsidies. Diversification, on an industrial scale, doing exactly what Clarkson stumbled into almost by accident with a farm shop and a pub. It's not just the big photogenic estates doing this either. Family farms nobody's ever heard of are running the same maths in private and reaching the same conclusion Clarkson reached out loud. A field of solar panels doesn't need feeding through a drought. A campsite doesn't get taken out by blight. For most of those families, that's not a lifestyle choice. It's the difference between keeping the farm for another generation and selling up to whoever's buying. Stand back now and look at the whole picture, because none of this is really about 200 acres in Oxfordshire. £6 million bought that farm in 2008. £144 was the profit everyone laughed at in year one. £21.3 million is what the brewery alone made last year. $50 million was the offer he turned down flat. And this year, on the very same estate, the number is 0. Not a mistake. A number chosen on purpose, in writing, before a single seed went in the ground. That is not a farmer failing. That is a business owner reading a balance sheet more honestly than most of the government departments meant to be reading it for him. It is not a farm anymore. It is a flywheel, and this year it simply pointed itself somewhere the cameras almost missed. You cannot manufacture that kind of honesty. You can only find a man willing to put it in a national newspaper, and then point a camera at what happens next. Whatever you make of Clarkson, and this audience runs the full range from devoted fan to firm skeptic, he did something worth having here. He took a conversation that usually happens quietly over a farmhouse kitchen table and put it on the front page where a government department couldn't pretend not to hear it. If you've enjoyed today's story, do subscribe and tap the bell, and have a look at the video on your screen right now, which covers exactly how that same brewery turned a shed of rejected barley into £50 million Carlsberg couldn't buy back.